Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they got it right. This is Tom Noble, your host, and I have with me today a dear friend of mine and business partner who's getting himself all resituated there is George Brennan. George and I have been working together for, gosh, George, I was calculating it, almost 20 years when you really think about it. And it's delighted to have George with me on this program. I had the privilege of Kathy and I having him here at our home over the past weekend. So we schemed up some stuff for you today, and it should be pretty good and steamy. But before we get going on that, I want to be able to promote to you a conference coming up here in July. It is, I introduced it a little bit, was the Go Therefore Conference 2020 that's coming up. And it'll be in the recording. You'll see it there at the bottom, the link and information. And then at the end of the program, there will be a video promo that is there for those that will be looking at this at the archive at where? None other than SamuelAdamsReturns.net, where you can get all the archives for this program. So with that, George, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, outstanding. It's a delight, as I said earlier. And so why don't you give the folks a little bit of background of George Brennan and where are you? What have you been up to? And what's some of the things that even you and I are working on from, first off, from that consulting side of the world?
Well, I'm going to start back from my youth. I grew up as a Boy Scout, and one of the tenets of the Boy Scouts, in addition to having fun and learning how to become a responsible adult, was primarily an environmental one, which was leave no trace. And it's something I've taken with me throughout the years, whether it's been me growing my own garden and making my own compost and mulch, to teaching other children, my own children, and then other young adults into the Scouts. Same principles, leave no trace. And it carries forward into the business world with me, where we have gotten involved in sustainability and now morphed more into resource management because sustainability has been hijacked. And resource management is more about the protection of the assets and resources of most organizations, which are the human resources, financial resources, and of course, natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it involves energy, it involves goods, it involves money, it involves people, it involves real estate, and we can go on and drop down from there. But the core essentials are those three principles: human, financial, and natural resources that we gear on. We've made it a consulting business. As I said, it morphed out of sustainability, more from a prospect and a objective of profitability. So part of our aim and our bottom line is the bottom line of any organizations, and sustainability really is the key word for most businesses. Sustainability, especially between the COVID lockdown and now the rioting and peaceful protest, whatever that means. Sustainability now means to be able to keep above water and keep afloat.
Yeah.
And so how are we going to be able to how are we doing that? How have we been doing it? How are we going to approach it when all the rules are changing and everything below us is becoming quicksand? So we're looking at it more from a perspective of what is important. How do you maintain this? How do you go about opening as quickly as possible within the confines of social and environmental objectives that are being thrown at us like hand grenades?
Yeah, no, yeah. When you and I first got into this, we really did the back and forth, because I always take that real hard-nosed approach on things, and you softened me, especially as we looked at that hijacking of that whole concept of what is sustainability and what does it mean to be sustainable. And, when we're looking at that, I kind of want to hold that in reserve because we'll really delve into that in the second and third segments. But I think that's been critical and important from our conversation over the weekend was, what's happening in our churches, whether it's Catholic Church, which, you're a conservative Catholic, and myself as a Reformed individual. It just takes us down that path is that where have the pastors gone? And how do we really, when we look at us as parishioners or, as congregants, how is it that, we're trying to sustain our Christian life, let alone, with all the other insanities? I mean, take that to bring us back into kind of some of the stuff we talked about, George.
Yeah, I mean, I'm watching the erosion of backbone, for the lack
Mhm.
of a better term, from the hierarchy of my church, and a lot of others. I mean,
Yeah.
there nobody is. It's ironic how you can go into a supermarket. There can be hundreds of people passing each other, standing near each other, Costco, Walmart, wherever, and have no problem. But they're limiting churches, congregations to accumulating of 10, now 50, maybe 100 people. It's mind-boggling that St. Patrick's Cathedral doesn't have, still 1,000 people that, with even social distancing,
Yeah.
that they can't have that. And, I think what it really comes down to is a couple of things. I think that it's just been a left-leaning movement, even within the churches, toward
Yeah.
more of a secularity. There is also reputation that they're all worried about now because social media, the mainstream media, are all putting them under the magnifying glass and
Hmm.
very quickly willing to, you know, really burn them any chance they can. And the last is fear. The mainstream media, the left, universities, and academia have positioned everything to a point of fear.
Hmm.
So, and they're kowtowing to it. So
Yeah.
nobody's taking a position to it.
Yeah.
If this had happened 300 years ago during our founding, we wouldn't have a country. It
Yeah.
was the pastors that stood up. It was the pastors that stoked the congregants. It was the pastors that delivered messages and governance, and it was also guidance from God.
Right.
To be to stand up for what it is.
Yeah.
And if you were to look at the pandemic or the so-called pandemic, I mean, there is a virus out there. It's pretty bad, but it's
Yeah.
afflicting a certain segment of our population that are elderly, infirmed, usually in a couple of medical classifications, and later stage in life. And what's happened in our nursing homes and in some of our hospitals is criminal.
Well,
And
with that, so just, real quick on that one. Now, see, to me, that should be the place, especially that pastors and priests should deal with, because, Christ tells us to deal with the sick, the orphan, the widows, and all of that. So when we look at that, even from that biblical perspective, and they isolate the elderly to the point that their spiritual needs cannot even be met, let alone some of them in their medical needs. George, I'm telling you and I talked about. I don't have to tell you because you and I've gone back and forth on. Wow.
and you know what? And you can look back in history from the time of the early Christians where they were forced underground into the catacombs. The sacraments were always administered.
Yes.
Throughout the years, whether it was invasions by different tribes or whatever else, the faith still survived. They still practiced the sacraments, whether they went underground or not.
Mhm.
Even during the bubonic plague, with the exception of a few places, the sacraments were administered. Even during great crises and wars, you look at World War II, where Catholic persecution was
Yeah.
second to the Jews, they
Mhm.
still got the sacraments in. So for us to see the sacraments just totally shut down, the left has figured out how to stoke fear and defeat us.
Yes.
And now they're still handcuffing us. They're allowing people to riot, protest, gather in large groups of hundreds, if not thousands of people without having a problem with social distancing or masks or whatever else. And in fact, what's burning? Churches.
Right.
They're trying to burn churches. And, so that our clergy are not standing up for this, are not practicing, is based out of fear and out of reputation. And you look back at Jesus, one of his first miracles was lepers. The same thing with the original disciples were going out there and they didn't have fear and they administered sacraments. It didn't matter.
Right.
So, here we are. And the irony is that Reverend Scalia, who is Anton Scalia's son, who's a priest, wrote an article called Priests Without Parishes, talking about the dilemma of them not being able to administer the sacrament.
Right.
And, to me, it shouldn't be a dilemma. It should have never been allowed.
Right.
Never been allowed. They should have towed the line and accepted social governance. Yeah. But again, fear won.
Yeah. It was the same thing, that we saw during the founding era, when there was that, as you already pointed out, there was that discrepancy between, even within the denominational basis, of authoritarian push that came out of the Anglicans in particular, and all of that was coming to the country. And as we look at some solution opportunities, we're down to our last 3 minutes. And one of the things that you and I were discussing, and you picked a really cool URL a while back, and we're kind of in that process of developing that. You and I did some high-level sketching. Why don't you give us about a 2-minute talk on that, and then I'm going to interrupt you so I can close out this segment.
Absolutely. So a few years ago, sort of as just a perspective of my viewpoint, I created a domain called aviewfromthepews.com. Initially, and I just referred to my initial notes, was just looking at being a Catholic, the sign of the cross that is administered by priests and deacons, and kind of had a humorous look at it because my pastor has a very finite sign of the cross. In fact, it's so small that it's like laser focused. One of the other priests does a almost floor to ceiling, ceiling to floor swipe at it, and then a very broad stroke. So he probably makes a sign of the cross that's 9 feet by 6 feet. And then I have another priest that I noticed that does more of a bus type windshield wiper where it pivots from his elbow. So his elbow stays centered, but his sign of the cross kind of goes up and down and sideways like a bus windshield wiper. And then yet another priest that has a yoga movement. It's just one giant flow, never taking the pen off the paper, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so along those lines, also some church signs, bulletin errors, etc. And I thought I would pick out inaccuracies, inconsistencies, and have humor, but also to use that as a focus of bringing in more factual based, whether it's architecture of a church as their shape, if they're inverted, as a ship or an ark, to the history of stained glass, the Stations of the Cross as art and storytelling. Same with stained glass windows, and to take it from there. But again, from a laity point of view, to be able to talk about religion from that point of view, and to really educate people and having little tongue in cheek,
right,
with it, plus a little history to go with it.
Yeah, and we'll pick up a little bit more in the next segment on that, because I think that crosses all of the, especially different denominational construct, as we talked about that earlier, and our founding fathers clearly understood that. Sam Adams did, and we're going to come back in the next segment with George Brennan to be talking about our founders' perspective in life. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they got it right, and this is Tom DeVolz, your host. You can find all our archives at samueladamsreturns.net. And as I do, and as you can see my guest, George Brennan, with me today, and we'll get back to George and some of the things we were talking about in the first segment and do a deep dive into some stuff. But before we do that, I would like you to make sure you go to Liberty Works Radio Network and check out all those other hosts and hostesses, that live programming where you can call into the programs during the week in the afternoon hours. And as always, find that button. Find that button that says donate, because this is a listener-funded network, and we really appreciate you participating in that and making sure that everything stays up and running. Also, I just want to promo again the Go Therefore Conference 2020. And again, there's going to be a video there at the archive page for you to take a deep dive into that and where you can sign up for that. I will be one of the guest speakers on that program, and it's going to be a good time when we get there. So I'm returning back. Hey, George, glad you're back again. Well, you haven't left, so it's been fun. And we were finishing up, and what we're talking with as a lay person's perspective and the opportunity to take a view from the pew, and you focused initially within your Catholic background, heritage, and looking at different aspects of that and what that can mean and how that will be in there on the website. You and I talked about some of the other historic perspectives from a Protestant perspective, and that being my favorite book, obviously, is The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution, and yet how it all ties together for how we govern ourselves, first and foremost, and then, how we're able to govern within our nation based on our Christian heritage. So you got any other quick comments on how you see that site developing? And
Well,
we'll
think
get there.
it's really, yeah, Tom. I think it's really important to look at the history of Christianity from its founding, with Jesus and his initial core disciples, and how it branched out. Even just looking at the the initial 12 and how they branched out, how 11 of the 12 died as martyrs. John was called the White Martyr just from having outlived everybody else, and so he died, maybe a little bit a lot differently. But the aspect of how it branched out from there, spread out geographically, how the word has spread, and then down back, and through the years with the Crusades, the give and take of all that, and then back down to the Reformation with Martin Luther King, and then how
Martin Luther King left.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You know what? It's on everybody's tongue in America. You can't.
Right now it is. I mean, but they got it all confused.
No,
So,
I know. Well,
yeah.
and I think that he should be part of our conversation too. I think he certainly contributed a lot to American history.
Yeah.
And his words should be ringing a lot truer now than they are.
Yeah.
But to look at I wouldn't call it a fragmentation, but how the Lutheran Protestant Reformation created other groups and other religions and formed off and splintered off into so many thousands of other congregations, and where we are present today.
Mm-hmm.
And then to kind of balance where orthodoxy lies versus secularism, and and everything in between.
Right.
And so I think if people would have a quick reference, and I'm sure it's in out there in the internet somewhere, but if we can centralize it and just say, hey, what is the Rainbow Coalition, or what is a Unitarian Church? What is Methodist, First Methodist? What is a evangelical? What's born again, etc. And give a basic, and then describe what it is, and maybe even have a geographic. Hey, I'm in this zip code. What church? What flavors
Yeah,
of church are in my zip code?
yeah,
So,
yeah. And I think that one of the things that from my perspective, that people will eventually enjoy and appreciate is the Brennan humor that will be expressed in various aspects of it, whether it be in prose or poem or in song. So I'm sure that'll be a keynote somewhere within that.
we'll certainly expand into those as well. I've done a lot of, I wouldn't call it sacrilegious, but I've done a lot of rewriting of hymns and different songs and verses over the years, Shakespearean to others, at the jest and
Yeah,
you know
but it'll be
on
fun.
sacrifice of others. Yeah.
Yeah,
So definitely it will be fun. It will be educational. It'll be hopefully inspirational, and it'll be a place that people can share.
right.
One of the things I really love is traveling around, trying to make it to mass wherever I go, and even if there's not a mass, to visit different churches, shrines, cathedrals, and I've done it in China. I've done it in Europe, and throughout the states for sure, and never ever been disappointed in finding some small detail, or being shown something by a parishioner or clergy, or just searching something out. So
Yep. Good.
there's plenty
Well,
out there. There's
oh,
tens
yeah.
of thousands of churches, and
Yeah.
I'll never get to see them. But if everybody can take a little pride in their little piece and share it with us, I'd love to be able to have that kind of an exchange.
Yeah, yeah, great. So let's talk about exchange now. A good segue word, if you will, is that the exchange that captivated my thoughts when we were talking last week, and when we're seeing these explosions over an event that, in many ways, happens across the country, but not from such a recognizable posting as this particular one was, and don't want to get into the weeds of the event itself, but what you and I were talking about in relationship to the aftermath, and that aftermath being that once again we're seeing, especially the major cities, yes, they're democratic cities, they're burning, they're being trashed, property damage out the kazoo. And you brought up a real twist that I said, well, do we look at that from a conspiracy theory context, or do we look at it from, what are the potentials of those underlying factions that are causing the havoc? Antifa, anarchists, they're sourcing their monies and their tiebacks into where we started the conversation today in the first segment on sustainability being hijacked. And what does that mean in relationship to all this physical damage throughout the cities? And you said something about, yeah, they had to burn it down before they could implement the new Green Deal. And I went, whoa, take off on that, George.
Well, I mean, the Green New Deal is the only way that they could get it passed is they want to be able to tie it into infrastructure. The infrastructure's been working well. The economy over the last several years has been hitting on all six, eight cylinders, whatever you want to call it, operating as great as it ever has. And so they've derailed it. The first
Hmm.
was the COVID
Right.
virus, and then you can see where it's out, where it's already opened up. The economies are being restored. Everything's working and getting back to normal.
Right.
In certain states, we call them blue states, and Democratic controlled. They've got the throttle down. They're keeping everything closed. They're making goals that are not attainable as part of their phased reopening.
Hmm.
And so the now that they found an excuse to start rioting and looting, they're burning down and destroying the cities. and it's just a matter of time before they get to landmarks. They almost got into Macy's. Can you imagine if they burnt that building down?
Oh my.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or
I,
Saks Fifth Avenue, or St. Patrick's Cathedral. I mean,
well, see,
last year,
okay, George, let me
before
interrupt
Notre
you for a
Dame,
second.
yeah,
So, you and I, when you say Macy's, some other people may be thinking of their mall. Now, you have to. One of the things that we didn't bring out, folks, is George is a lifelong person that has grown up, lived in that in New York. He knows the city. He lives out on Long Island area. So when he's talking about Macy's, he's talking about down there in Manhattan, right?
their flagship store. I mean, it's a whole city block. It's, I think it's 13 stories, maybe even more.
Right.
I don't even know how many square feet it is, but it's at 34th Street between 6th and 7th Avenue.
Yeah.
It's where the Macy's Day Parade ends and a lot of other functions. And it is a landmark and a bastion of New York City commerce.
Right.
So it hits on a lot of fronts. It's a prime real estate in New York City. It is a bastion and a flagship of capitalism, and it
Yeah.
it can be attributable infrastructure.
Right.
My
So,
point being,
yeah,
yeah,
go
that
ahead. That's where I wanted you to go, is to the rest of
down,
that.
burning down areas like that, Madison Avenue, Fifth Avenue, 34th Street, lens for then the New Green Deal, New Green Deal and GND, Green New Deal, to come into play because they can start rebuilding it. Of course, it won't be rebuilt as a retail. It'll probably be some sort of a social experiment or a cooperative building or what, I don't even know.
Yeah.
But
So how about that same thing, just take that, and that's New York, and some people sit there and go, "Oh gosh, what about that?" But look at these other cities that are having those types of attacks, and even those that are out, from outside in that peripheral area. Look at what's happened with some of the targets and some of those. The cost to rebuild or to recreate that infrastructure like you're talking about from that retail side who's in the toilet sure doesn't make any sense in my, when I put the pen to
oh,
paper.
no, and this is different this time in that they're going into areas that have never been attacked before.
Right.
All the other riots that have happened were generally in areas that were in poor communities, and so it made that community even more poor. And that's happening now in some of the places,
Hmm.
where it started
Right.
in Minneapolis and
Yep.
in Detroit and Chicago, Philly, and it's a shame because it's affecting the communities that can least afford it, and it's affecting minority-owned businesses and
Huge.
majority customers.
Right.
So, but now it's going into areas where who thought Macy's or Saks Fifth Avenue,
Right.
Soho, they
Oh
went in
yeah.
and got all the Rolex and, the Nike stores, the Apple stores, and they're in and out. It's planned. And, you know, there's a book called State of Fear by Michael Crichton, published in the early 2000s. And this is the playbook. It's playing out exactly like that. In that case, it was eco-terrorist, but the whole idea of them winning their environmental argument, which is sort of the new Green Deal, um,
Right.
is, but a little bit different, was that they hijacked nuclear weapons to set off. I won't do the spoiler, but the idea was just to create fear and get people, into that
Right.
area. And so
Yeah.
here we are between the COVID 1984 aspect where everybody's wearing a mask and everybody's got a social distance and
Right.
shutdown of the whole economy, to
Right. So,
now, riots in the
yeah.
street and
Right.
burning down the businesses that can least afford it.
Yeah.
And
So
then
we're
you
gonna we're
also
gonna
have,
have to. I'm gonna
yeah,
stop you right now just
yeah,
for closing out this segment, and then we'll pick all of that up in the third segment. But folks, I mean, that's the real key element that we're talking about from especially a liberty perspective. We know that during the founding era, there were times that there were major disruptions. There were homes that were even destroyed, governors' mansions, and so on and so forth. But the real pursuit was true liberty because of the way that that the Parliament was posting things upon the people, how our commerce was being destroyed. And we're going to pick that up because that's where Sam Adams really made the arguments, and so did the Anti-Federalists as they looked at the Constitution. So come on back for the third segment, and we're going to really dive into this. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns, and this is the third segment, and we're having my good friend and my brother from a different mother, as my wife would say, George Brennan. We're having a really good time here. Go to the archives, folks, to get not only the podcast, but also watch the video, because on that, we're welcoming back in this third segment, as I always do, our friends from Soaring Eagle Radio, and sponsored there with Dr. Mike Spalding and his wife, Kathy, and that's a Kathy with a K, where mine's a C, not my name, but my wife's name. And we also want you to make sure that you go to the end of the podcast and the video to find out more about the Go Therefore 2020 conference. We're looking forward to you taking and signing up for that in July. Boy, where we left off in the last segment is talking about the destruction that's happening, what that means for the new Green Deal or Green New Deal, or whatever its nomenclature is, and George will help me on that. But what the comparison I was saying in that last 30 seconds was that during our founding era, there were a number of riots. There were the burning of some homes, the destruction of the governor's mansion to an extent there in Boston, and other activity like that. But that was going after real liberty, because the enemy of the nation here wasn't a nation at the time, but the enemy of the colonies, that being Parliament, was trying to suppress business, was trying to take and destroy our economy, our banking, everything that would allow people to survive from that perspective of a free people, even in Great Britain of the time. And they were being turned into slaves, into economic slavery, into those types of minions, if you will, instead of being a free citizen, a sovereign citizen. So those are some of the things that I think people forget a lot about, is that we are those sovereign citizens. So when we have this whole nonsense of COVID, granted, it may be a terrible flu, but the way that it was manipulated by the bureaucrats, the whole idea of forgetting that we are sovereign citizens, even in the minds of George, because like you and I have talked, they've been so dumbed down from the educational side of things, that when it comes to the destruction of infrastructure, it leaves open those doors for then what we're seeing with the Pelosi reconstruction bill. And that's not a reconstruction bill for constructing anything, but for their policy takeovers, for bailing out the states, and slipping in all of this stuff here for this whole environmental insanity. I mean, what say you?
Well, the environmental insanity is just that. Basically, it's real interesting, and we could spend hours on the subject, but renewable energy that is being pushed by the Green New Deal is weather-dependent renewable energy, wind and solar. They only operate when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And so there's no rhyme or reason. The experiments that have gone awry in Europe and in Australia should be alarming to us, but we don't hear about it. Mm-hmm. But they fail. And any of these energy forms, while ideologically are great in concept, don't work. They're very expensive, and they require 100% fossil fuel backup. So it's just posture pushing. It's been going on for 50 years. The technology has never improved beyond, maybe 32% efficiency at best, and that's on a good day.
So go ahead. So I was going to say, as you move to the SO, I use SO a lot, not the SEW, but the SO. People are always looking for my needle and thread and think I'm going to be darning socks. But besides that, uh, why don't you talk about and give the URL, and it'll be in the video so people can find it, for
Yeah.
what's this thing about a tree hugging capitalist? What in the world is
So,
that, George?
as I stated in the initial segment, as a Boy Scout, I and as an adult, still I adhere to the credo, leave no trace. And tree hugging capitalism is basically being able to operate freely in an economy um, in capitalism, where there is a balance of trade and market, and that we have a respect for human nature and for natural resources, that we don't deplete them. I always use the example of lighting $100 bill with a lighter and just letting it burn. What was the purpose of that? To show
Right,
that you can afford to do that? I don't know.
right,
But whether it's having a leaky faucet or throwing something out your car window or throwing a lit cigarette butt out into a dry field, it's disrespect for the environment. My belief is that we are a moral and ethical society, and if we learn right and we practice right, we should leave the world a better place than what was given to us.
right. And
And we
one of the
possess the
things,
technology to do it, whether we have the uh, moral wherewithal to do it is a whole other thing.
right? I mean, you and I talked about it. What it really comes down to is from, our biblical Christian heritage as well, being what is stewardship. And I think that's a lost term. And it, again, no different than sustainability, it becomes a manipulated term. So the tree hugging capitalist, what's the URL for that?
TheTreeHuggingCapitalist.com.
Yeah. And what's going on there?
So basically, what I'm doing is I'm sharing my experiences within the environmental movement, starting back from Earth Day in 1970 to present term as to what has happened over those years and how it impacts businesses. The the what would you call it? The green business or the environmental business, or actually, I would really now it's called climate change, but it started off with the next ice age. It went to from ice age to ozone to acid rain to global warming to now climate change. So it takes in anything that happens. But we're looking at the climate business and how it affects the business climate.
Right.
And so we want to be able to reach out to chambers of commerce, to trade associations, and whatnot, and really give them a primer as to how the environmental movement and how all environmental regulations and um, um, industries and NGOs are impacting Main Street.
Right.
And if
Yep.
people understood that global warming, tidal, what would you call it, sea level rising, pollution, et cetera, if they were really to understand the facts and not the modeling and not the hyperbole of it, and really understand the science of it and the data, they would have a clearer understanding of what's going on and a different perspective.
Okay, all right, I got to stop you there again because one of the things that you said, and one of the things that I brought out to people a number of different times relative to modeling when I was doing some work in telecom industry and we were doing high performance computing stuff. We were out at a lab out there in central Washington where all the global data comes in for the climate, atmospheric stuff. It all goes there. And the keepers of that data were definitely saying that it's all buck dollar driven as to how that data is extracted from that raw resources. So what you just said on modeling, I take that it is exactly comparative to the disaster that we're in at the moment with this COVID thing, because modeling always has an underlying purpose. And, I mean, I think you already inferred that to some extent.
Well, I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist if you've been involved in the climate business as I have for a while and seen the erroneous models that have been predicting gloom and doom for the last God knows how many years. But since the UN got involved in the late 80s and started having their Conference of the Parties and the COP21, which is the Paris Agreement, which is probably the most notable of recent times, with their projections that the global temperature was going up, carbon dioxide was rising, one was tied into the other, and in fact, it's not the case. But if you were to look at how they did the modeling to scare people in fear and how the COVID models emulated that, they're no difference. And at the end of the day, it's a fear-stoking tool by the left to get to their ends. So whether it's people worried about the environment, we're all going to die because the earth is getting warmer, or that we're all going to die because the COVID virus is being spread exponentially. So, the initial model that they came out with out of London, where it was going to be, 2 million deaths in the United States and God knows how many worldwide, was so far off, and
Yeah.
but that was the initial build out and that was the initial fear factor. And so they
Right.
were able to cower people. And even though they, brought it down, the fact of the matter is that, they
Well,
were able
fear
to,
controls.
yeah, yeah,
Fear controls. And, as you're going through that, and I was thinking the fear controls, I was just trying to look at how the modeling has taken and failed in so many different ways, and the way that you just tied the two together, it just takes and it continues to prove one thing on all that aspect of those models: we're all going to die.
yeah.
I
Well,
mean, at some point, God appoints our time. We don't know what it is, when it is, but it comes to, as you and I talked over the weekend as well, is that we're all going to die. We're not,
well,
there's no other way around it.
I
And
think I
what's your
think the
perspective?
point well, my perspective is this: is now that they've learned how much fear they can instill through the COVID, they're going to accelerate their efforts with the environmental movement so that the models are going to change exponentially with the so-called global warming, sea level rising, water shortages, etc. So, we
So,
could go
so
right down that
yeah,
line, but that's
let's
going to be
jump
the
on
next thing.
this.
Yeah.
Let's jump on this. We're down to our last 2 minutes, and I'm going to definitely cut it off here in the last 30 seconds so I can close it out. But what can people do, George? I mean, what can they do right now? I mean, we want them to go to thetreehuggingcapitalist.com, start following that blog, look at that real data. I mean, you got a fun thing in there that's called, what is that, treat a week?
Well, it's called Carbon Munchers, and
Yeah, there
basically,
you go.
I, you know what? If you're worried about the environment, you're worried about too much carbon dioxide in the air. Trees love carbon dioxide. They take it and they pump out oxygen. And if you were to take a look at the NASA satellite photographs over the last couple of years, you will see a continuing increase in the amount of green coverage around the equator and between the two tropics, where growth and production of all types of foods and foliage is expanding exponentially. So carbon dioxide is good.
So
And
we're down to our
it,
last minute. So what we're
yeah,
talking about is go ahead, plant a tree.
yeah,
What
plant
else?
a
Real
tree
quick.
and grow more vegetables. The more carbon dioxide we have in the air, it's interesting. If you were to go into any kind of a greenhouse where they produce vegetables, they're pumping the carbon dioxide over 1,000 parts per million, and we're at 400 parts per million. So we're talking about 4/10 of 100%, 4/10 of a percent of our atmosphere is carbon dioxide. So don't worry about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's the important thing. And, when we look at, thank you for being here, and Sam Adams, he truly understood how this all ultimately would tie together for our liberties. And so did those anti federalists when they looked at what does it mean for the ideas of good governance. And that's what it really comes down to in the bottom line. So, folks, come on back next week to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti federalists, they got it right.
Hi, friends. Dr. Mike Spaulding here to announce details of the Go Therefore 2020 conference. This year, we will be providing a powerful lineup of scholars, researchers, authors, and Bible teachers for the equipping and edification of the body of Christ. Please note that the Go Therefore 2020 conference is an online event. This will enable you to participate wherever you live. Registration is now open at www.gothereforeconference.com. The cost for this one-of-a-kind conference is only $59. The theme of this year's Go Therefore conference is What Now, Church? What lies ahead for the Church of Jesus Christ? How must we respond to the government's reaction to the coronavirus? What must Christians do to address the so-called new normal? This year, our speakers include Dr. Michael Lake of Kingdom Intelligence Briefing, Pastor Carl Gallups of Freedom Friday Radio, Pastor Caspar McCloud of Spiritual Encounters Radio, Russ Dizdar of Shatter the Darkness Ministries, David Heavener, actor and film director of The Last Evangelist on davidheavener.tv, Coach Dave Daubenmire of Pass the Salt Ministries, Pastor Brandon Gallups of Redeemed Ministries Healing and Recovery Center, author and researcher Doug Woodward, author and researcher Carl Tykrib, author, evangelist, and director of Hand of Help Ministries Michael Boldea, author and researcher L.A. Marzulli, researcher and Bible teacher David Paxton, constitutional scholar and host of Samuel Adams Returns Tom Navolis, author and evangelist Preston Condra, Stephen Menking, senior editor and host of On the Objective and the Amateur Society podcasts, David Arthur of I Belong, Amen Ministries, film director and researcher Tom Dunn, author and director of Omega Dynamics Jamie Walden, author and editor-in-chief of Technocracy News Patrick Wood, author, pastor, and president of Chafer Seminary Dr. Andy Woods, and of course me, Dr. Mike Spaulding. You may register right now at the conference website, www.gothereforeconference.com. The conference starts Friday, July 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and concludes Sunday, July 26th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. All registrants will have 2 full weeks to watch every presentation from this year's conference. Conference schedule is on the website, www.gothereforeconference.com. You do not want to miss this event. What now, church? God bless you.